Level 3 Nutrition. So today we're going to be looking at the relationship between nutrition and physical activity. So by the end of this session, we're going to be talking about ATP supply, understanding the importance of that in muscle contraction and exercise, and looking at the role of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins for fuels in aerobic and anaerobic energy production. It really links to a lot of our anatomy and physiology lectures as well, talks as well, specifically the ones on muscle contraction and energy systems. So it's really good to listen to this alongside those other lessons as well. So let's see what we've got. Now, as a bit of background, I've put this in thinking about why we need fuel. So in order for our muscles to be able to contract, they have to have a ready supply of what's known as ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Now, this is a really reactive molecule and we can't store it within our muscles. So our muscles can only contain ADP and phosphate ions, which then need to be joined in order to make ATP. And the energy of ATP allows for the actin and myosin filaments to slide over each other using that ratchet mechanism and for muscles to be able to contract. There are very small quantities of ATP in the muscle, but literally only enough for a second or two. So the fuel to be able to synthesize ATP from ADP and phosphate can be gained from predominantly from food, the food that we eat, which is a breakdown of fat, carbohydrate or protein at times. But there's also a supply of something called creatine phosphate in our muscles. Now, this can make ATP, but only under conditions that require 100% effort for less than 10 seconds. So which fuel the body decides to use really depends on the duration and the intensity of exercise. So that's the only conditions in which creatine phosphate is used. Everything else, the fuel is going to come from our food sources. So carbohydrate or a mix of carbohydrate and fat are the main sources of fuel to produce ATP. So let's take a little bit more look at that. So we need to know that when carbohydrates are broken down in digestion, they're broken down into glucose, but the body can't store glucose. So glucose is stored in the form of glycogen, which are long branched chains of glucose, and these are stored within the muscle and the liver and then broken down to glucose as needed. The glycogen that's stored within muscle cells is only used for that muscle cell and can't be used elsewhere, can't be transferred. And the glycogen that is in the liver is mainly used to maintain our overall blood glucose levels. So if our body, this is linked to homeostasis, if our blood glucose levels fall, then our brain stimulates within us a hunger response in order for us to go and obtain more food supplies, or it triggers that breakdown of glycogen into the individual glucose molecules. When you have prolonged exercise, and we're talking, 60 to 90 minutes really, the brain can stimulate the use of proteins. And proteins, when they're broken down, are amino acids, and they can break down the amino acids that are the building blocks for muscle to convert into glucose. And this process is called gluconeogenesis. It's not the process of choice in the body, but it's kind of a backup option when other energy supplies have run out or in low supply. So the factors that affect glycogen storage, there's a few that we've got here. Basically, the better trained a muscle is, the more it can store glycogen. So the fitter you are, the more glycogen you are able to store and therefore have in reserve. The more muscle mass that you have, again, obviously, the more muscle you have, the more glycogen storage capacity that you've got. And if you're eating high proportions of carbohydrates in your diet, then you're able to easily replenish glycogen stores. So those are three main factors that affect our ability to store glycogen in our muscles. So how long can these stores last for? Well, obviously it depends on how big the stores are, but if you've got moderately hard activity, then the glycogen stores are going to last about 60 to 90 minutes. But just if you've got normal day-to-day activity, it's going to be 4 to 5 hours until they run out and need to be replenished or other food sources used. So how can we maximize our glycogen stores to make sure that we can maximize that fuel supply for our ATP production? So we know that they run out every 4 to 5 hours. So we need to, before training, ensure that we're regularly topping up our carbs every 4 to 5 hours. So in order to do this, we want to be eating small, regular meals to reflect our activity levels throughout the day, obviously increasing the size of the meals relative to the amount of activity we're using. We don't want it all to be turned to fat, so we need to aim to consume most of our calories when more active and ensure that we're not getting to that point of getting really, really hungry, because once we get to that point, it's much harder to make those healthy food choices, and we tend to consume things with higher sugar and fat content. So again, coming back to training, we need to consume either a light meal up to 2 hours before training, or a bigger meal can be consumed 2 to 4 hours prior to training. The kind of carbohydrates we want to be eating are the low GI as opposed to the high GI, because that will give us that steady release of energy throughout the day rather than sugar sort of spikes and troughs that we want to avoid. The high GI foods, however, they do have a use, and immediately prior to activity, they might be useful to provide an immediate supply of energy that's going to hit the bloodstream and give us that energy fuel immediately. So that was pre-activity. Now, during activity, we said that the stores last approximately 60 to 90 minutes. So if you're doing an activity or training session that lasts longer than this, you might need to consume some carbohydrates during the session. So the aim is to consume approximately a minimum of 20 grams of carbs every 30 minutes. Once the activity is finished, you want to consume carbs afterwards to restore your glycogen levels back up to their full levels. And really, you want to be having those as soon as possible after that training has finished, so that that window of opportunity lasts about 2 hours after exercise to refuel. But it's best if you can do it within that first 15 minutes post-exercise to get the optimum benefits. So post-activity, females generally, and these are all just general guidelines, want to refuel with about 40 to 50 grams of carbs, and males between 60 to 80 grams. Obviously, you have to bear in mind the intensity and the duration of the session that you've just done and adapt those levels accordingly. So if your session is of lower intensity, then your requirements for refueling are lower, and vice versa for that. So in summary, let's have a little look at the role of carbohydrates. So the main function of carbs is to provide us with the energy we need to convert ADP to ATP. But most cells in the body actually use a mixture of both carbs and fats, and when absolutely necessary, protein when those are limited for energy. The muscle cells particularly rely on carbs for contraction when energy intensity is high. So we need that preservation of our stores of carbs during aerobic activity to be as optimal as possible. So we're just going to briefly look at protein. So remember that generally our protein requirements during aerobic activity really are very minimal, but an increased intake is ultimately going to compensate for any breakdown of muscle tissue that occurs due to depleted glycogen stores. Remember that once the glycogen stores run out, the body might begin to use protein and amino acids as a source of fuel. And as I said, this normally takes place between 60 to 90 minutes after moderately hard endurance training, when those muscle glycogen levels have really dropped. And that process again of converting muscle protein to glucose is called gluconeogenesis. So the protein requirements are increased then for strength training, because during strength training you get those micro tears in the muscle, and there's an increased requirement for muscle repair following these sessions. So there is a higher need to intake protein following this kind of training. And then looking at the role of fat, in summary, fats are abundant. We have small supply of fat within our cells, but predominantly we have a lot of stores sort of subcutaneously under our skin and other places in our body. So during aerobic activity, that tends to be when fats are used as an energy source, trying to preserve our use of carbohydrates. It needs to be fairly lower level aerobic activity for the most efficient fat burning. But the fitter you are, the more effective your fat oxidation is earlier into their workout. So less fit individuals will use more of their carbohydrate stores before they hit their fat stores. But once you're fitter, you start using those fat stores earlier on in your training. However, to be able to burn fat, there has to be oxygen present. So anaerobic activities cannot use fat as an energy source, because obviously anaerobic means there's no oxygen there, and fat burning requires oxygen to be present, which is why they need to be the lower level aerobic activity where there's going to be plentiful supply of oxygen. So there we go. So that's the end of our look at our relationship between food and physical activity. We've looked at the different sources of fuel. We know that creatine phosphate is a fuel for ATP production for maximal effort for a very short period of time, up to 10 seconds. And after that, the body is going to rely on a mixture of carbohydrates, fats, and when absolutely necessary, proteins as an energy source when the other two supplies are limited. Thank you very much.